Hello, Ian. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm okay.
Good.
TGIM.
I know we haven't been here for such a long time because, well, we've been doing other things, but Ian, you've been traveling. And so I want to hear all about your travels, and of course, why not do a podcast episode while we do that? But we thought we would talk today about how travel really reinforces the fact that we have very different worldviews, and that it actually creates this relativity for us. It reminds us that reality is relative. So that's what we want to talk about today. But Ian, how are you and where have you been?
Um, I'm well. I'm back physically and psychologically and spiritually in Victoria, Australia. But for 5 weeks, my partner and I spent time in the Americas. We flew from Melbourne to Santiago, Chile, and arrived at exactly the same day and time that we left Melbourne, 13 hours earlier.
Yeah.
And I finally got to set foot in that amazing continent of South America, which, when you look at the globe, the shape of Australia nestles into the west coast of South America. We used to be joined up.
Right. So you can see the history of that. That's
And
good.
what an amazing country, like 4,000 kilometers of this strip of land, which is only like 120 kilometers wide.
That's
Um,
incredible. That's like the width of Melbourne.
I know.
Is it really? Almost, yeah.
And we hung out with a guy that we had met in the line to go into the Eurovision Song Contest in Vienna in
Of course.
2015, who took us on a walking tour of Santiago City. I mean, we'd been told that the place was dangerous, and since the riots there in 2016, it was a
Right.
no-go zone, it was
Yeah.
Badlands. So we ended up staying at the Novotel in a very shishy part of town because we were told that the old city was dangerous. I was like, what a load of rubbish. I mean, sure, we're
Right.
two tall white men, but
Yeah.
we didn't need to run from the taxi into the hotel. I had a fake wallet with a fake credit card in it. I didn't need that.
Didn't need it. Yeah.
But we did visit the history. An incredible museum called the Museum of Memory and Human Rights, devoted to maintaining the memory of what happened during the Pinochet regime.
Wow.
It was up there with my visiting Hiroshima in terms of
Yeah.
reminding of the human condition. Um, Chile was,
That would
I mean, it was it was a little tiny taste of Chile, and then we flew
yeah.
up to Mexico City, and I fell immediately head over heels in love with that amazing metropolis. Oh my God. Old people have a life there. They're dancing salsa in parks that have got beautiful fountains, and they're mingling with kids on skateboards and children with balloons and organ grinders, and it's just
That
people
sounds very ideal.
they just live life, and there's a
Yeah.
socially valorized role for older people. I was
Yeah.
just like, oh my God,
Mm.
this is what this is what life can be. You know, every culture has its strengths. Well,
Yeah.
and the people are so welcoming. Oh my God, the food, um, the kookiness, the zaniness, the energy, the incredible architecture, this gigantic museum of anthropology that I could have spent a week in.
Mm-mm.
Um, just yeah, and we went to Oaxaca, and I visited Teotihuacan. I always say this wrong. My Anglo mouth says Teotihuacan, but it's Teotihuacan, the ancient citadel that this ancient culture created with the temple of the sun and the temple of the moon and the avenue of the dead. And I
Wow.
mean, it used to have 100,000 people in it.
That's
And
incredible. Such a rich ancient civilization, and you can see the. What did you see? What's still there? What are the ruins like?
oh, amazing.
Mm.
I mean, the civilization had already declined. They think that people left because of climate change and, humans damaging the ecological sustainability of the wider environment. But I mean, all civilizations come and go, right?
Mm.
Including,
Yeah.
including ours.
Including ours, yeah.
And I mean, it was a multi-ethnic metropolis. It had different ethnic quarters that people had created from all across the Americas. So it was already sort of like it had Little Italy and and Soho and Chinatown. Well, um, and this is about this is what I think the traveling experience did for me. Like you read about the human sacrifices carried out on top of the Temple of the Sun to
Yeah.
honor the sun god, who was their primary god, and all of the local animals, cheetahs and jaguars, sorry, and lizards and birds, all had animistic properties. They had spiritual agency in that culture.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are all sorts of skulls buried in the foundations of those buildings. And they used to have a ball game where uh, you had to push this giant latex rubber ball in the direction of the sun. And if for whatever reason you were responsible for the ball going backwards, you had your head cut off.
That's a game of high stakes.
And I said to a Mexican guy there, like, I mean, sure they sacrifice children, but our society sacrifices children to McDonald's or,
Mm-mm.
dare I say, the Catholic Church or any other institution. I mean, the thing I learned, I guess, is that for the people at the peak of that civilization, that world that they inhabited was their reality, and
Yeah.
everything that occurred within it didn't need them to go, oh my God, this is a different culture. What do I say or do in this situation?
Yeah.
Because that was their reality.
Yeah.
Um, and it reminded me of a brilliant psychologist called Seymour Saracen. He was sort of like one of the founders of community psychology, and he back in the 40 years ago, he published a paper called If It Can Be Studied or Developed, Should It Be?
Mm-hmm.
Published in the American Psychologist. And I remember very much from my undergrad, um, it left a real mark with me because he was saying that whatever period of time, wherever we are on the planet, we're not living just within a worldview, but we're actually captured by it. Um, we're driven by it. It becomes our reality.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and when we go traveling, there's that clash because we suddenly realize that our worldview doesn't fit that context.
Exactly.
And I think that's what was so valuable for me.
Yeah.
Because I'm also preparing this book at the moment on the psychology of place, and there I was. I took all these draft chapters that my wonderful contributors have shared with me, and I promised them that I'd read them, but I didn't read one. I was too busy experiencing place, you know.
Exactly. You're experiencing place, so you didn't want to be working. Tell me a little bit about the book because we haven't actually talked about your book on the podcast. Just give me
Hmm.
maybe a brief sort of how did the idea come, who's publishing it, and who's involved. Yeah.
I'm the son of an architect and a school teacher, and you know, the die was cast quite young. I'm a migrant, a white British migrant to Australia, and this continent has always spoken to me in a way I can't really define. And when I was 19, I got back on the first jumbo jet out of Perth that I could get on and explored my own ancestral roots, visiting stone circles in England and
Mm-hmm.
Roman ruins and Hadrian's Wall and Celtic this and whatever that. And the book sort of brings that together because I think Western culture has a very extractive view of place and the planet. Um, the Bible, oh, not the Bible, but the Christian interpretation or the convenient Christian
Mm-hmm.
interpretation of the Bible is to go out and take whatever we want from the planet because we're the chosen species. But an indigenous perspective is that we are of the earth. We are one of many, a multitude of life, and our place is within that, not at the top of the pyramid. And there's this notion of being of country with a capital C in Indigenous culture in Australia, which is it's the part of the book is trying to explore. There's all this work that's gone on in environmental psychology of place, and geographers and poets and artists are all of our pop songs usually have some element of place in
Our
it.
connection to place. Yeah.
24 Hours from Tulsa or California Dreaming or,
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
but if you're of country, you're born to look after that country. It's not just about place identity, it's about place destiny. It's actually about being almost like a conscious expression of the land and the
Mhm.
environment around you. and you have responsibilities to care for that country and a specific part of it, a specific plant or the animals that live. Or, and like, I'm giving you a very white bread, clearly settler colonial perspective on what I think country means.
Yeah.
But the book's unpacking that, and there are some
Nice.
amazing First Nations authors writing about it, and
Fantastic.
trying to match what the research, because a sense of place is this term that makes us all feel good, and it's used to sell housing estates at the edge of cities. It's used to sell traveling. Um, and a lot of our tourism is about going to a place where there is some vibe and a feeling and a sense of history,
Mm-mm.
and it's almost as if we can't create that in our own place. And I just was in the United States where, having just visited Mexico City, and loving, say, for example, Tokyo, which is full of incredible infrastructure that means people don't need a car and it's high
Mm-hmm.
density. And then ending up in LA, which I do actually quite like.
Yeah.
But in many ways, the first impression is, oh my God, this is like a whole series of really interesting places that are you've got to go through the Badlands to get there. And
That's
it's
right.
it's just interesting how when you travel, you get to see how other places are designed, which is a function of their own history and the ideology and the power. And I mean, LA used to have one of the world's most sophisticated tram systems, but it was all taken up when the motor car came along.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're rebuilding a metro system, and it is quite good in lots of ways, but it's very small.
Mm-mm.
And I was the only white person on that train half the time because
Oh, wow.
it's the culture there is if you need to use public transport, it means you can't afford a car and
Yeah.
therefore you're. But I mean, there's this notion of the rights to the city. It's a philosophical movement, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And the work that I do around place and livability is that everyone should have the right to get the things that they need to live a good life within
Yeah.
easy access. I don't know how well that exists in a place like LA where we talked to Latino people waiting for a bus that was half an hour late, and they said sometimes it doesn't turn up at all, and we have
Yeah.
to get to work. Like,
Exactly. So that really impinges on their rights and access and ability to be even part of the economy, right? So yeah.
absolutely.
What more?
So I'm wearing my Luce Libre t-shirt.
Yeah.
We went to the wrestling in Mexico City, which is
I love it.
this is also my love of the Beatles and Abbey Road. But Luce Libre,
Fabulous.
it's this incredibly wrestling where these guys and women put on these masks and do these very, very performative shows.
It's
It's
fab. I
hilarious.
I can't believe it. I would love to go to a Luce Libre.
That's just what I loved about Mexico City.
Yeah.
There's an appreciation of fun and absurdity. And it's a tough city for lots of people, don't get me wrong. Like on the outskirts, it goes, there is incredible poverty there.
Yeah.
But even on the outskirts of the city, they built this huge cable car system that goes across all of the hillside suburbs on right at the edge of the city, and it actually connects people for like 10, 20 cents or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
The little cabins come across every 3 or 4 minutes, and that
Oh, okay.
brings them to the nearest uh, underground train station. So there is a real effort to try to make places more inclusive. I
Yeah.
was really impressed by that.
Amazing. And so, going back to this conversation, that the topic we were going to talk about today was how does this how does this concept of worldview relate to what we do in work and in organizations? And I think that how it relates is that it's kind of the point that you made. When you're in a worldview, you're captured by the worldview, so you can't see outside the worldview. And travel reminds us that there are other worldviews. And in the same way that sometimes going from one organization to the other reminds us that there are different ways of seeing the
Mm-hmm.
same challenges and problems.
Mm-hmm.
And, at a national level or even an international level, we can see many conflicts right now globally where worldviews are unable to be debated and differences dialogued, but like in the wars that we're currently seeing, but also in national campaigns in the US. I think the presidential campaign is a sort of a real mark of perhaps worldviews clashing. So before we dive into how this might play out in organisations, what's a worldview? I think you've explained how you feel when you're in a worldview or when you step out of that into another. But what is a worldview? Can you give me a definition?
So, I mean, most of us are born with the same sensory equipment: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, touch.
Yeah.
But I guess the worldview becomes the operating system that actually interprets that and combines it into information about what reality is. And I guess it helps us navigate
Yeah.
life in a particular time and place. I mean, clearly we absorb it through our skin and our senses as we're children. We learn about the things that are valued, the things that are punished, the things that are
Yeah.
rewarded.
We also learn about what is true and what is not true in relation to beliefs, and which are part of the worldview and not necessarily true elsewhere. But we believe
That's
we
right.
learn about what's true for us, what's relatively true for us. Yeah.
So, I'm a middle child, and I think I spent my whole formative years going, this isn't fair. Shouldn't be like this. Um, and I think, my inner curmudgeon that has followed me through into my early 60s. I think I've spent a lot of my time working in organizations, pushing up against the membrane of what is
Yeah.
considered to be acceptable or normal or commonplace. And I think going to a different culture gives you a chance to understand that is entirely contextual, I guess.
Yes. Yes.
But I
It
guess
is.
I guess there's also your own beliefs about what is good, what makes a good society, what is fair,
Yeah.
what is just, who deserves to be at the table, who doesn't, who deserves to be rewarded. Um, is it by virtue of how they
Mm.
look? Is it by virtue of their behavior? Is it by virtue of what they've done? I mean, even when you're talking about going from organization to organization,
Yeah.
that is absolutely true. But even like, when we're going through customs in Australia, either exiting the country or coming in, we have an immediate impression of the worldview of Australia because those
Yes.
customs people. And for example, when you go to the United States, you're dealing with the same institution, but an entirely different way of
Yes.
presenting their expectation of the world. The
Yeah.
the expectation.
I find our customs process to be somewhat, I find it somewhat inclusive and helpful. I find when I go through US customs, it's quite intimidating,
Oh,
and I don't feel that level of welcome or inclusiveness. There is nothing that really says to me, "Welcome to this country" through customs. It's more it's more that they're looking at me as a threat. So
absolutely.
that's definitely just from the symbols and um to the level of it's all sorts of symbols of power that are there,
Mm.
to the level of the staff, what they're wearing, the colors, the barriers, and and the because customs, everybody knows you go through customs, you line up, you might go through some kind of
Mm.
checkpoint. That's the process, but how that's enacted and how symbols are a part of that
Mm.
process make a real difference to how you feel about it.
The semiotics, right? The meanings that are embedded in
Exactly.
even the design of a place, the colors used.
That's
Do
right.
you zigzag and wait for 2 hours whilst trying to get through?
Yeah.
Uh, in Chicago just the other day, having come from Mexico, they have all these electronic doors that open and close for each person. So you're kind of hermetically sealed whilst being questioned slash interrogated by the
Yes.
border security person.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Mm-mm.
Um,
Whereas, for example, I would apply that to organizations. some organisation and front doors of organisations differ now because, we're virtual, we're online, we're remote, as well as, in person in offices. But there is a level of sort of, that experience you get when you walk into a foyer, for example, of a building, and the whether you're welcomed, whether there's a threat response as soon as you walk through, it's that kind of thing. So it makes a big difference. It tells you about what they value and actually tells you about the national culture too.
Yeah. I think institutional arrangements are a real window into the psyche of a country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I was reflecting on how amazing I thought it was that older people in Mexico have a role to play, that tells you about age and wisdom and experience and the value of having older people in community to maintain intergenerational learning.
Yeah.
And since I've been home, I've been online looking at people posting stories in Melbourne about their elderly mother being fed slop in a nursing home and her begging to be served a croissant, and being served something cold and stale, and it's just
Not
like,
respectful.
where's the dignity of the older person? And I guess that's something that's more present for me now. I'm in my early 60s, and I have to say that my 1 week in America on the way home in the United States, I mean, I sort of had whiplash coming home because Trump had his assassination attempt. Then Biden stepped down, and then Kamala Harris steps in. I was like, oh my God.
Yes, lots of I've been fascinated with American politics. It's lovely.
But I think that is an example of worldviews just clashing.
Yes. Yeah.
This current debate about whether Kamala Harris is black enough. I mean,
Exactly.
the racism.
Exactly. And I was just at a industry forum last night that WorkSafe is doing a really great program called Workwell. They're putting on industry forums that I'm part of. I've been lucky enough to be part of, and we are discussing how organisations can address psychosocial hazards, which include gendered violence, and how they can prevent that by creating inclusive cultures. And we talked a lot last night about intersectionality, because there are systems of oppression that work together. So the question about are you black enough is irrelevant, and it's actually quite ignorant of the fact that there are different systems of oppression that work together for people of colour, for people who have culturally different backgrounds. Maybe English is a second language, and then you intersect that with other systems of oppression, for example, homophobia, and so there's sexual orientation discrimination there, but also
Ageism.
Racism as well, and socioeconomic status as well, and so and many other forms, difference or marginality that actually come into a system of oppression. So I get quite I get quite mad in a way when this morning Donald Trump was talking about this issue, whether Kamala Harris, is she Indian or black? And frankly, that's irrelevant. So, and I think that society like Australia, I'm actually really pleased that we, in our politics anyway, don't have this crazy presidential competition. I'm really glad that we're not party to this sort of dialogue. Well, it's not really dialogue, this competitive grunting at each other. But I'm not. That's not to say, of course, that Australian politics is, absolutely pure and positive and constructive. But it's not. But we don't see that here in Australia, and I think partly it's because of some real clear national cultures that drive our worldview. So in Australia, our national culture has more of a social, democratic set of values. It comes from some of our history here in Australia, whereas in America you have much greater power in their national culture. So there's this idea of individualism and competitiveness that then drives some of this sort of competition we see in that political race.
I agree with you to a point, but I think we both as white people, white settler colonial people in Australia, I think we're captured by our own worldview, which is the dominant discourse around
Yeah.
whiteness being normal or the default
Yes.
setting.
Very
And
true.
I think maybe it's because I have the luxury of preparing this book at the moment and reading work by First Nations writers, but
Mm-mm.
I think it's not that long ago that Australia voted no to having First Nations acknowledged as the
Yes.
original custodians of this land.
Yes. Very true.
And the white oligarchs made a lot of incredible progress by using a couple of people that looked presented as representing Aboriginal people, presenting actual views that were uh,
Not representative.
destructive to
Mm.
First Nations. And also,
Yeah.
when we had our first Prime Minister, we had our version of the GOP describing her as professionally barren because she didn't have any children. And this is a current horrible strand of discourse from JD
Yeah.
Vance in America.
Oh, yes. That's very true. That's very true. And yeah, Julia Gillard's experience of that isn't that long ago. You're right.
Vance is saying that people who choose not to have children should have less human rights and not be able to
Yeah,
vote or than
basically.
people who do. And it's like, hang on a minute. We've got 8.5 billion people on the planet right now. Is reproduction really our only purpose for being here? Again,
Exactly.
another example of worldview that's just rooted in, and I think they're saying it's coming from a white supremacy perspective that America needs to be rescued from all the brown people that are
Yeah.
sort of tipping the demographics towards being, white minority. There's all sorts of
Yeah.
things going on. Um, I think I was saying that I spent that week in America and got whiplash. I think for me, the way the media lined up to get rid of Biden, I thought it was really shameful and really ageist.
Mm-mm.
Um, but I also stand corrected. I think the outpouring of energy with Kamala Harris
Yes.
is extraordinary.
Yes.
But the thing about ageism, which is reflected in institutions and organizational culture, is when we denigrate older people, we're actually denigrating our future selves, which is
Exactly. Yes.
it's a real irony of ageism.
Yeah.
Um,
It is. Yeah. And
uh,
I tend to agree with you. I think that there could have, I mean, obviously there could have been better ways of creating that transition. And it kind of played out in the public as in that way. And definitely it was very ageist. I kept thinking about my mother who's 80 and, how disrespectful a lot of what was said about Joe Biden and how that would have landed with her and very disrespectful to her. So I think that we have to have better ways of creating transitions in a more obviously respectful way. And you would hope that there are better ways of doing that. And talking about there's this assumption that there's a decline with age that is almost quite linear,
yeah.
right?
And it
So
took the irony was by focusing on Biden's age, it took focus off this insane, weird person and this insane, weird worldview that they're pushing, which is
mm-mm,
humorless, joyless. It's about punishing. It's about
yeah,
stripping away women's rights. I mean, that took the focus off that and the
yeah, exactly.
corruption and the
Yeah.
nepotism.
Yeah, Ian, you're saying that the other worldview is weird, however, there are many millions of Republicans who share that worldview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many, many millions, and so that's a worldview, and so
Yeah, yeah.
and so we can't disregard it. We can't just say, well, that's weird, and therefore they're crazy, because they're not. There are really intelligent people who believe in some of those tenets, maybe. So, Ian, I think that when you're confronted with perhaps different worldviews, and particularly when the worldview you're confronted with is, has some tenets or beliefs that are really different, really diverse, and maybe even competing with some of the beliefs that you have, I think there's some cognitive dissonance that occurs. You immediately, I think, because we're wired this way, we're wired to accept information more readily that fits into our worldview and dismiss information that doesn't fit into our worldview. But I think particularly in organisational cultures that are attempting to build more inclusive cultures, and particularly at the national and international level where we're dealing with conflict and competing worldviews, there's got to be a way of creating dialogue between people and between groups who have different worldviews. Is there anything that you're thinking about there? Perhaps what are some strategies maybe that you've used in the past
Mm.
that kind of help us do that?
First of all, as you were saying that, I started thinking about Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher who was talking about the structure of scientific revolutions, who
Yeah.
argued that pressure builds up and one worldview starts to develop ahead of steam and it starts to be completely
Yeah.
incommensurate with the other one. And something happens and there's an explosion and there's a paradigm shift that's quite abrupt.
Yes.
Um, and, other philosophers talk about worldviews changing in through some sort of process of osmosis or evolution, incremental change, if you like. I think that was Karl Popper. But I mean, both might be true at different times and in different settings.
Yeah.
Sometimes the Bastille has to be stormed, I guess, based on our human biology and the way we operate as, you know, primates or whatever.
But that's a very long-term
It's a very
perspective.
long.
I'll give you a scenario. If I was talking to someone the other day, a really dear friend of mine who is very much steeped in Republican, US
Uh-huh.
Republican values. She's an US citizen, so she's got a vested interest in what happens in that
Hmm.
country. And I think if I was voting in the US, I'd probably be more, I'd be voting for the smaller parties or perhaps more,
Hmm.
liberal, and I have more liberal leanings, not all the time, but I think in that context I would. And so I wanted to dialogue with her because I'm not going to dismiss her. She's a really dear friend. So I sort of started that conversation by really just being open and a bit more curious about her beliefs.
I think you have to find out what people value, and it's
Yeah.
about finding the core building blocks of the worldview. Um, the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation in the United States did some really important work around communicating the social determinants of health to a Republican audience. And the social determinants is a human rights framework. It's about the rights to the city. Everyone needs a good early start to life. They need
Yes.
to live in an environment that's safe and healthy and inclusive of children and older people and people with disabilities and women and young kids or whatever. Um, the right to work, the right to have good jobs, the right to have good housing, the right to have the ability to walk down the street and not get mugged. I mean, those are the social determinants of health, and they shape a person's life. They shape the
Yeah.
life of an entire society, if you like. So when the purpose of the Robert Woods Johnson's work was to communicate to a Republican how those things, if you value freedom of choice, um, and the right to choose,
Yeah.
the right to living a good life, then you've actually got to address the values in that Republican worldview that's around, um, yeah, the right to have access to that stuff, so that you can be free to make the choices that you want
Mm.
to make.
Mm.
Um,
So you saying that the strategy they used was to understand where the values alignment was.
mm,
So to
yeah,
go back to a sense of, and this is what negotiators do, don't they, with conflict? They go, well, what do you value? What do I value?
yeah.
Where are the commonalities between what we value? And
Hmm.
then let's start there. Is that what?
I think so. I mean, I don't know how this works. I mean, I think when organizations maybe deteriorate to the point that they're almost about to collapse and that the founders are walking away and people are saying, why am I even here? This place no longer speaks to me, or I'm wasting my time, or it's actually causing me moral injury,
Yeah.
then I'm not sure if you can actually do that at that point. I think maybe speaking to values can happen at a certain time and place in an organization's
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if the decay becomes so profound, if the corruption and the implosion and the groupthink and the cult becomes so strong, I'm not sure you can actually do it.
Yeah.
I don't. I think we would need to ask some trained negotiators about that. I mean, it's almost like
Mm,
saying, how do you negotiate with Jim Jones in Jonestown
mm,
before
mm.
everyone drinks the Kool-Aid? I'm not sure what can be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And beliefs are pervasive. So I think you're right. It's not to say that these are the when beliefs are reinforced over time and particularly in a closed environment. So when organizations are closed, um, then beliefs are reinforced over time, and those pathways in the neural network are very, very, they're deep trenches. So I agree. I think sometimes, that's difficult. I do a lot of work in organizational culture where we can measure how open or closed an organization is. And I think that's a really important element to keep track of how open or closed you are, because if you're open, you're allowing for new ideas to come in, and there's a place where they can be debated and dialogued in a respectful way, and that causes that incremental change that you're talking about, where
mm,
there's incremental shifts in worldviews about how, for example, how leadership should be done, how work and business should be done, what we value, what's recognized. And I think that can happen. And then sometimes when, for example, and we saw this, I think the Me Too movement was a really good example of this, when there is so much harm and oppression in the system, then you do need some kind of radical movement to really blow that up, to
hmm
blow apart those worldviews. That those beliefs are actually maintaining a system that's causing
hmm
harm through systems of oppression. So I
Yeah.
think so there are times where you have to blow things up, but I think most of the time what we're dealing with in organizations are an ability to stay open enough to really
Mm.
create that sense of incremental improvement. And leaders have a really big role to play there.
Oh.
Leaders can work in a closed system, or they can work in an open system. And one of my previous guests, Jim Stevenson, just in the episode before this one, was talking about the fact that he often deals with organisations perhaps that have highly regulated contexts. You have perhaps finance organisations, or even government organisations where there's huge regulatory mandates and they are operating in a regulatory environment. And often people in those regulatory environments will say, we can't change anything. We have to have this closed system because we're operating in a regulatory environment. We have compliance issues. We have to make sure that we're monitoring those risks. And what his response is, yes, but the way you work leading up to putting something out in that regulatory environment is not regulated. So you can be open, you can bring ideas in the way that you ideate, in the way that you're talking about what you do, in the way that your people are working together. That can be open, very open. And then, of course, when you put your services out into that regulatory environment, there are rules that you have to follow. So sometimes we create constraints for ourselves because we believe in the constraints under which we're operating in, but it may not be the case. That may be just a
Mm.
belief.
Do you think regulatory environments are ways in which we codify worldviews into rules?
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and
I think it's a lag, though. That's the thing. Our
mm,
regulatory environments often lag behind perhaps the kind of real worldview in the system. But yes, absolutely. They absolutely codify that. And this is why I think we need to keep opening up to new ideas, because they are, you see it. And also once legislation, once rules are in place, they're often difficult to change. And so they always lag behind.
and they codify the worldview of the people that hold the most power, or the people that think they
Absolutely.
have the most to lose. If you codify a worldview in which people of different skin tone can't form relationships, or
Exactly.
you know,
That's right. And in a way, that's why, for example, when we talk about being inclusive more in relation to gender, for example, a lot of even our HR practices, a lot of the ways in which we select for promotion and recruitment have been based on a very white male dominated framework, because it was white males that were at the table when they created those HR practices or those rules. And so a lot of that needs to shift based on an understanding that we didn't have a representation at the table that was open enough to really incorporate a different way of doing things that mitigates that bias, that gender bias, for example.
So here's a case scenario. I think you and I have both worked in places that had a wonderful culture. There was real camaraderie, there was fellowship, there was open learning, there was, institutionalized encouragement of risk taking and exploration. And then for whatever reason, a key person leaves and they're replaced by someone else with an incredibly different worldview that might be around micromanaging or power over rather than power with, or that famous saying that the beatings will continue until morale improves. I mean, I have left places where they say most people leave a job because of their manager, right? It's
Yes,
not the
they do.
work.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what are your thoughts about how do we deal with that within an organization where there's a change and someone in a position of power and influence comes in with a very different worldview, one that actually can cause moral injury if you stay?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
do you do?
I think often what happens is that so leadership has enormous impact on organizational culture. So we need to, that's what I do for, that's why I'm in a job. We need to keep working on leaders leading the organizational culture that they want to create in the organization. But you do get leaders coming in sometimes who can really shift that, and who can disrupt a really great team. And what needs to happen in a way is, I would be looking at that leader's peer network. So what's happening at that peer network, or perhaps the leader above them? Are they, sometimes the ends can justify the means. So that leader comes in, maybe they're getting the results that they need in terms of tangible results, but they're burning out the people underneath them, but they're producing, right? So, is the organizational, in some ways, is the organizational culture one where the ends justify the means, or is the organizational culture one where, yes, we are looking at our metrics, we're looking for that increase in performance, but how we get there is really important. And so in organizations where the means do not justify the ends, where you have that kind of culture, organizations put in place metrics and ways of tracking throughput. They're tracking the how, not just the result. And so I think that it's at that cultural dimension. What kind of culture do we want? Do we want to have a culture where, yes, it's all about the result, and what we measure, we pay attention to. So if we're just measuring the output and the outcome, we're going to be, blind to what's happening along the way, right? So we need to be really aware of what happens when what are we evaluating? What are we recognizing and rewarding? If my bonus is tied to a certain result, then and I'm not measuring anything else, then of course the ends justify the means.
Yeah.
The way I'm measuring that is actually showing me that it's hell for leather. Let's go for it. We can burn out teams because we just need to get that result. So I think it's definitely in the culture that we're trying to create, and we can create different cultures. Within an organization, you can have different subcultures too. So sometimes I sort of work with teams and I say, you've got control over the culture you create here. So I think we can do that.
Okay.
You convinced?
Well, just thinking systemically, I'm sure the orchestra on the Titanic had a great band leader, you know.
I did. That's right. That's right. But, they played till the end. So, you know,
I think what everything you're saying is true, and I think this is one of the paradoxes of organizational life is we can create strong, resilient teams within organizations. But I think I don't know. At some point, the external, well, the environment in which those teams are
yeah,
encased,
yeah.
so can't
And
ignore.
exactly. And then this is why we have, women, opting out of corporate life. This is why we have people who are from culturally diverse backgrounds opting out. The institutions we work in are very difficult to change, and sometimes you can't create the culture you want. So a lot of them opt out, they start their own businesses, and that's actually a way of dealing with that
Hmm.
particular scenario. And I hope that we can have different ways of dealing with that. I hope, because I think that that's a real loss to our institutions, and I would like to see us move beyond attrition like that of really good people, because our cultures are a mismatch. But sometimes that's the only way. That is the only way to deal with that issue.
So, how much of your work is actually spent helping to surface worldviews that different tribes within organizations might hold? I imagine there's a lot of that work.
Well, some of what I do is particularly look for alignment. So I think that to your earlier point about where do the values align, I don't start from where do we differ. I start from where do we align. So if I want to work with the team, that's where I start from. If a team has a common purpose that is based on their values, where it is a personal identification with what they're trying to achieve, then even if you have very different people in that team with very different and even competing worldviews, they will work together to create a space to dialogue and in service of that shared view. So it's almost like you've got to create that North Star for a team. And I always look for alignment first, or create the alignment.
I think I'm even talking about the step before that, though, which is actually helping people understand what the world looks like to each person, each team.
I do it with fun and high engagement to help people understand the differences that people bring, the contribution that they bring. And because one of the conditions that I'm looking for is the team leveraging its diversity? Because we know from the research that when you leverage the diversity in your team, the results, skyrocket. So, and that can be cognitive diversity. It comes from differing worldviews, and it comes from just differing experiences and contributions. So often you
Hmm.
have people in your team and you don't know enough about them, and therefore you're not leveraging skills,
Yeah.
knowledge, dispositions, differences in the way we communicate, differences in being able to understand and empathize with the diaspora around them. So if we're really leveraging that, teams hum. So yeah, it is one of the conditions. We call that condition right people, because it's about having the right people in the room. And for me, the right people is a diverse team, not a homogenous team. Yeah.
I love the memes that sort of tap into some of this stuff. Uh, one of them is like offices are hell with fluorescent lighting, or we engage in not brainstorming but blame storming. That
Yeah.
those sorts of asides actually are windows into the culture, aren't they, of a
They
place?
are. They are. Particularly, I think particularly our younger workforce expect better, which is great, right? They expect better, and we need to rise up to that. Otherwise, they will continue to operate in the gig economy and not enter institutions. And so we want to harness that entrepreneurial spirit. We want to harness that ability to be innovative and, take the unexpected route through life to end up in a better place. So I think that that is a challenge. That is a challenge for organizations. So, but it's, these things are I'm an eternal optimist. I believe we can change. I believe
Hmm.
that our work is to work with institutions to change them, because like we started by saying, when confronted with a differing worldview, there's two choices. You can dismiss it or you can lean into it and understand it. And I'm not suggesting that we need to change everybody's belief. Changing beliefs is very difficult. So, but when you have differing beliefs, you rise above that to what are we trying to achieve here? What is in, and you hear that even in, those national political systems. What are we trying to achieve? We are doing this in service of the nation. We're doing this in service of the people. So when you can rise to a higher order, something outside of the individual, then when you get people doing that, great things happen.
I, I
Magic
think
happens.
I think the explosion of energy around Kamala Harris is that it's her campaign's being driven by people in their 20s, and there's that whole fluidity of messaging, expectations about the world, an expectation of inclusion that I
Yeah,
think older people haven't grown up with and
yeah,
therefore don't understand.
that's right. And it was like I went to this event last night by WorkSafe where we were talking about gendered violence in the workplace and mitigating that and intersectionality, and a lot of the audience were young women, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful. I'm hoping that we have some more men join the conversation as well, and we had a great discussion, and looking forward to some actions coming out of that as well. But I agree. I think that the expectations are different, and so um, but that's not enough. That's not enough because institutions are difficult to change. We need to be deliberate. There is still work to do. Still work to do. So on that, Ian, we might have to leave it there. I'm going to give you the last word though.
Oh, are you?
It could be something. Is there something from Luce Libre you want to share? Like something that you learned from
Oh,
Luce Libre?
I remember a slogan from the 80s when I was at uni, which was, I wanted to change the world, but I couldn't find a babysitter. Um, I'm not sure what Lucha Libre would be about. I wanted to change the world, but my mask didn't fit. Or I think Lucha Libre would change the world because it's camp, it's funny. It actually makes fun of overtly testosterone sort of
It does.
baboon machismo, and people celebrate the campness of it
Yeah.
whilst also really loving the contest that goes around it. So
Yeah.
maybe Lucha Libre for president. I don't know.
Oh
Let's
yes.
let's
Okay.
let's vote someone in that has a mask on.
Right.
I don't know. Won't be me, but.